At first, it seemed like just another isolated experiment, an obscure project with no official records, carried out in a hidden scientific base beneath Neptune's moons. No one outside the circle knew its name, only a symbol on the metallic crates, the Greek letter delta. When the first capsule was activated, there were no hallucinations, no tremors, convulsions, or screams. There was silence, but in the user's mind, something opened. Not a portal to another world, but to many. And thus was born the most feared and sought after drug of the 27th century. Delta. Delta had no color, taste, or smell. It seemed harmless, a translucent capsule the size of a grain of rice, programmed to dissolve under the tongue and be absorbed directly by the sensory cortex. But what it did wasn't chemical. It was quantum. Upon entering the body, Delta didn't affect the flesh. It activated a specific frequency within the brain, an oscillation capable of aligning the user's consciousness with parallel versions of themselves. Each dose was like tuning a radio to a different station of reality. It wasn't a trip. It was a shattered mirror where each shard reflected an alternate life. The first experiences were described as immersive. You saw versions of yourself that made different choices, felt the thoughts of a you who stayed on Earth, who never left that relationship, who died young, or was never born. Some used the drug to find answers, others to escape trauma. But all, without exception, came back different. At first, the effects lasted minutes, then hours, and then the first signs of contamination appeared. People returning with memories that weren't theirs, languages they never studied, knowledge they should never have had, and their gaze empty, as if part of them was still there. Delta wasn't recreational. Delta didn't numb pain. It opened doors, and no door stays closed forever. Initially, Delta users were monitored. Neurological tests, interviews, constant exams. Scientists wanted to understand the effects, but there was something no equipment could measure: the emotions. Many reported a devastating sensation, not of euphoria, but of mourning. Mourning for lives that never existed, but that, for a few minutes, felt utterly real. A man saw himself beside a daughter he never had, a soldier, experienced peace in a world where war never began. Others saw themselves happy, free, complete in realities where they had made different decisions, or where the entire world had followed another path. And then they returned to the present, the cold station, the repetitive job, the memory of real life now reduced to one among 1,000 possibilities. This fragmentation began to cause what neuropsychologists called existential echo, a deep melancholy, a growing void, as if their current self was just a pale shadow of what they could have been. More than a drug, Delta became a poison to the very meaning of identity. Some began taking frequent doses, trying to rediscover the most comforting realities, relive moments, fix themselves in a version of themselves where everything made sense. But each use created stronger resonances. The barriers between realities grew thinner. And then came the first cases of identity collapse, people waking without knowing who they were, or swearing they had memories of lives in worlds that didn't exist. Reports of individuals speaking unknown languages, recognizing places they'd never visited, and describing future events with terrifying precision. The government tried to contain it, ban the substance, hunt its creators, but Delta no longer came from labs. It began appearing spontaneously, replicated by rogue AIs, sold in alleys of abandoned satellites, spreading by its own will. And the most disturbing part, in some realities accessed by users, a message began to repeat, etched on walls, whispered in dreams, encoded in visions. This is not your reality. You're only passing through. At first, it was called a side effect. Delta users began acting differently after a few sessions. It wasn't schizophrenia. It wasn't simple dissociation. It was something deeper, more structural. They remembered things that never happened, but with absolute conviction. They had traumas that didn't belong to their lives, emotional reactions to people they'd never met. One man cried upon seeing the moon for the first time, not out of awe, but out of longing. He claimed to come from a reality where Earth no longer existed. These cases multiplied. Over time, neurologists identified an emerging pattern. The brainwaves of the most affected users began changing permanently. It was as if the brain was being reformatted. But the most terrifying part wasn't what they remembered. It was what they forgot. A scientist at Helix 4 base began denying he had a family. He saw his children as imposters, his wife as an actress. According to him, his real life was on another plane of reality where he led an interstellar expedition. These patients weren't lying. They were convinced. Psychiatrists called it Delta syndrome, when the consciousness of an alternate reality partially or entirely replaces the user's original identity. Some became hybrids, living with memories of several lives simultaneously. Others plunged into irreversible collapse, trapped in a limbo of overlapping realities, unsure which was real. But there was a second phase of the syndrome, rarer, more feared, cases where individuals began demonstrating abilities they didn't possess before, fluency in alien languages, unlearned technical knowledge, even altered physical capabilities, as if something or someone from another reality was occupying that body. These cases were classified as non-native identity intrusions, and, officially, all were eliminated. Officially, in the DeepNet, unconfirmed reports speak of a group called the Awakened, people who survived total replacement, people who are no longer themselves, but also not someone else, multiverse hybrids, bearers of multiple memories, and perhaps pioneers of what's to come. Most Delta users reported only echoes of alternate lives, unknown families, different choices, small deviations from what they called the root reality. But a restricted group, the most sensitive, the most broken, began reporting something unusual, a presence. At first, they were just sensations, someone watching from the edge of dreams, shadows standing in the corners of peripheral vision, reflections, moving independently. Over time, the reports gained shape. No face, one patient said, but it has intent. A name emerged in DeepNet forums, the Watcher. An entity that belongs to no known timeline, something that lives in no specific reality, because it passes through them. Described as a bodiless consciousness, the Watcher appeared in memory fragments that shouldn't exist, always still, always distant until you noticed it, and once you did, it began to approach. Advanced Delta users began reporting similar symptoms, whispered voices between realities, phrases spontaneously arising in the mind, the absolute certainty that someone else was inside them. But this wasn't hallucination. Some of the phrases were in languages the users had never learned. One phrase, repeated in multiple accounts, caught the attention of the Cognitive Alliance's cryptolinguists. We are the echo before the choice, the fracture between what was and what should have been. The most feared hypothesis took form. Delta didn't just tune into realities. It summons something that lives between them, something that feeds on identity. Some say the Watcher isn't an entity, but a consequence, a consciousness collapse born when too many versions of you begin to exist at once. Others believe it is ancient, that it was once human, that perhaps it's what we all become when we fragment too far. But there's one silent certainty: those who see it once are never alone again. They called it resonant drift. It's when the user's mind began absorbing memories from alternate versions with such clarity. They confused them for their own. They weren't hallucinations. They were memories with scent, texture, emotion, a love lived in another timeline, an accident that never happened but left deep psychological scars. Some mourned children they never had. Others spoke unknown languages fluently. There were even those who returned with phobias and trauma from deaths they never suffered. In this life, identity ceased to be a straight line. It became a spiral of collapsed possibilities. Experts from the Cognitive Alliance's Temporal Neurodivergence section identified the phenomenon as echo-reality fragments of parallel lives, reverberating inside the host's mind. But there was an even more disturbing pattern. Users who reported the highest number of echoes began to disappear, not physically, but in essence. They disconnected from their own stories, forgot names, dates, bonds, and, little by little, became others, not a specific someone, but an amalgam of multiple possible versions, as if reality itself was trying to decide who that person should be. It was at this stage that the first cases of unfolding appeared. Individuals who, when looking in the mirror, saw a reflection that didn't mimic their movements. They reported being observed by themselves, but in another form. And in some cases, claimed that the reflection whispered things not meant for this world. The question that began circulating secretly in the psychotemporal surveillance communities was direct, disturbing, and still unanswered. What if Delta wasn't created to access parallel realities? What if it was created to replace them? It was no longer necessary to take Delta to feel its effects. For some, a single dose was enough. For others, simply being near someone who had taken it sufficed. What once was an experience induced by a capsule now felt like a contagious state of perception. The fissure, the name given to the opening between realities, ceased to be momentary. It anchored itself. It took root in the mind. It remained active. They called it delta persistence. Those affected described a recurring phenomenon, the sensation that the real world was lagging, as if the environment around them was always 1 second behind their consciousness, as if something was watching. From within, some began to identify repeating symbols, geometric patterns hidden in shadows, reflections blinking in sync with their heartbeats, sounds coming from silence that resembled distant voices. Then came the hollow mirrors, individuals who simply stopped reacting. They were there physically, but not. Here they spoke in incomplete sentences, smiled at inappropriate moments, drew maps with invisible ink visible only under infrared light. Agents of the Cognitive Coalition went on high alert. What Delta opened could no longer be closed. The universe was being stitched from the inside out, and the thread used in this stitching was the human mind, but no one knew how many people were already pierced by it, because, in the end, there were no symptoms, just a subtle shift in the eyes, as if something was looking back. And the question that specialists began to avoid wasn't whether Delta caused harm. It was, what if the harm is the purpose? It was during the monitoring of a patient in Delta persistence that the first direct signs of the entity emerged. The technical name was simply Class V nonlinear instance, but those who studied it closely began to call it the presence. It had no defined form. It made no sound. It could not be seen directly, but it left traces. In the containment camera logs, random frames showed impossible glitches, pixels burned in the shape of eyes, heat waves rising in frozen zones, temporal reverberations like time remembering something and trying to repeat itself. And most disturbing, when these files were played, sensitive viewers began to cry. Without reason, without warning, as if something inside them recognized what had not even happened. A group of neuroarchaeologists theorized that the presence was not a creature, but a living memory of a universe that had already collapsed, trying to stay conscious through our minds. And the channel was Delta. The more people accessed other realities, the deeper the presence rooted itself. It lived in the gaps between thoughts. It floated in the silences between heartbeats. It hid in the space between the image in the mirror and the reflection. At this point, researchers stopped asking what it was. And started asking who, because the presence seemed to know Delta users. It seemed to be waiting for them. "I'm not an intruder," said a voice recorded in brainwave scans of several affected individuals. "I am what's left when you forget who you are." At first, it was only confusion. Delta users reported memory lapses, forgetting names, dates, places. But these were not ordinary blackouts. They weren't forgetting everything, just what defined them. A man woke up without recognizing his own daughter, yet remembered vividly a daughter who never existed. With violet eyes and a triangular scar on her forehead. An engineer from the Ares 9 colony began signing documents with a name listed in any Earth database, claiming she was born on Velox Prime, a planet that appears on no astronomical chart. Psychiatrists attempted to explain these identity collapses as side effects from prolonged neural immersion sessions, but then the tests began to fail. A patient identified as Marcus Teven exhibited subtle genetic alterations in his DNA, as if an alternate version of him was slowly replacing the original. It wasn't just psychological, it was physical. It was real. They called it identity infection, and it behaved like a consciousness virus, transmitted through memory, triggered by emotion, reinforced by recollection. People near the infected began to feel fragments of other lives, small echoes that should not exist, a whisper in the dark, calling names you've never heard, a scar on your arm that wasn't there yesterday, the feeling of homesickness for someone you never knew. Reality wasn't just being accessed, it was being contaminated. And the scariest part, the infected didn't want to be cured. They said they finally felt complete. As if the reality they were born into had never truly been the original. No one knows who drew the first one. It appeared engraved on the floor of an abandoned mining station on Phobos, a circular pattern made of overlapping rings with symbols belonging to no known language. But when exposed to the neural frequency generated by Delta, the symbols activated. They didn't speak. They showed cities that never existed, submerged temples, creatures with glass eyes and stitched mouths, planets where time moved backward. Soon, more maps emerged on isolated colonies, in escape pods, even tattooed on the bodies of users claiming to have brought them back. Scientists began calling them fractured cartographies. Each one seemed to correspond to a specific version of reality, an alternate reflection of what could have been. But there was a constant at the center of every map. Where the rings collided, there was always a mark, a stain, a void. As if, at the intersection of all realities, there was something greater and unmappable. Advanced users called this point the gray zone, a space where all consciousness dissolved, where identity and time ceased to make sense. And some claimed that when they got too close to that core, they could hear whispers, not just inside their minds, but from outside reality. A recurring coordinate began to emerge from these maps, a location that, curiously, exists in our real galaxy, a forgotten point in the Orion Nebulae, classified only as Sector Q77 Beta. And a burning question haunted those who studied the maps. Were these visions merely projections, or was Delta revealing a real path, a dormant portal between realities? They called it the last door. It wasn't made of matter or time. It was a concept repeated in the deepest visions of advanced Delta users, a threshold, something you don't cross with your feet, but with the collapse of your own identity. Unofficial reports describe similar experiences. The moment the mind reaches total overlap, all possible selves, all versions, merging into a single awareness. In that moment, they say, you see the door, a pulsing void, with edges that tremble as if made of memory. And on the other side, something watches, something waits. Those who crossed door claimed to never return with answers, only with compulsively written, fragmented words. We were never one. The original is not the first. We're not accessing realities. We're being accessed. And then, silence. The last transmissions from a Kovar experimental lab in the Cassini belt showed an operator staring blankly at a white wall, murmuring, "The door doesn't lead outward. It leads inward." After that, the experiment was sealed. The records were classified, and the Delta compound officially banned, but it still appears in abandoned capsules, in deactivated stations, in dreams. As if the last door is always there, in some corner of the mind, waiting for the next dose to be the key dot. And now, only one question remains. Would you have the courage to open it?